Hi, I'm Frederick Enzio. This is my first video, so to quickly explain the premise of this channel, this is going to be me half video essaying, half ranting about topics that I really care about, ranging from politics to media. This week on my channel, TERFs, why they are factually and morally wrong. Basically, this video will be discussing what a TERF is, what claims TERFs make, why those claims are factually wrong, and sprinkled throughout will be some advice on how to argue with TERFs, but also difficulties in doing so. Why am I making this video? Well, in the Western world, public support for LGBTQ rights has steadily been growing for the last couple of decades or so. However, as LGBTQ people get more accepted in society, the resistance to their inclusion grows more and more militant. Reactionaries grow more and more furious at the steps towards inclusion that are happening, and in many Western countries, we are currently living in a world where LGBTQ rights are at a serious threat of backsliding, or, in some countries, already are backsliding. The group whose rights are at greatest risk are trans people, who are generally at the forefront of most attacks on LGBTQ rights, with many policies being proposed in recent years to limit trans people's access to spaces corresponding to their gender identity or access to medical transition, with far-right US Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene proposing a ban on puberty blockers and many other forms of gender-affirming care just as I began writing this video. My goal in making this video is simply to debunk some of the most common arguments or claims that TERFs make to justify their attacks on trans people's civil rights. This is by no means going to be an exhaustive video. I've argued with a few TERFs in the past, and this video will mostly be addressing arguments that kept coming up there or in discussions I've seen online. Also, this video will primarily be talking about trans women, simply because almost all the claims TERFs make are aimed at trans women, and since I'm addressing their claims, trans women are naturally going to be the focus of this video. So without further ado, let's get into it. Part 1. What is a TERF? This video is about TERFs, so a good place to start out would be to define what a TERF is. So to do that, I've gone to everyone's favorite source, Wikipedia, which defines a TERF as There's nothing on this paper, I'm just going to cut away and read it from my PC. TERF is an acronym for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, referring to a feminist whose advocacy excludes trans women or opposes transgender rights. The term was originally coined in 2008 to describe a minority of radical feminists who are unwilling to recognize trans women as sisters, and hold views other feminists consider transphobic, such as the exclusion of trans women from women's spaces and organizations. So in practice, TERFs are self-proclaimed feminists, or people who appropriate feminist talking points to exclude trans women from the category of women. They vary massively in their expression, from people who at least signal at progressive values, to TERFs who are reactionaries in all but name. Important to note is while this video is explicitly addressing TERFs, almost everything said here applies to transphobes in general. TERFs and regular transphobes generally make almost identical arguments on this topic. TERFs just tend to be misandrists, and regular transphobes just tend to be misogynists. But on this topic, they are generally in agreement, so unless I explicitly mention otherwise, transphobe and TERF can be used interchangeably in this video. But what do TERFs believe in, and how do they support those beliefs? Part 2. What are TERFs talking about? Hi, a quick interjection from future Frederick. This was originally planned to be a single video covering a wide range of claims about trans people. However, realistically that video would have been at least 2 hours long, so to make it slightly more digestible, I decided to divide it into parts. So this video will be discussing why TERFs are wrong about trans children and trans mental health issues, as well as serving as a general intro to this topic, with the next couple of videos addressing why TERFs are wrong about detransitioning and bathroom bills and sex and gender respectively. With that in mind, let's get back into the video. A TERF generally believes in something along these lines. Trans women should be excluded from the broader category of women and therefore not be given access to women's spaces or be offered medical transition or affirmation in their identity as a trans person. And with that in mind, these are the claims we will be addressing in this video. 1. Children are being forced into trans identities or they are becoming gender confused by today's radical view on gender. This confusion is bound to lead to unhappiness and unnecessary suffering. And 2. A ton of trans people suffer from mental health issues with high rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidality. By discouraging trans identities, we save people from the suffering associated with being trans. These are very interesting claims. If they were true, then that would paint a really stark image of the struggle for trans rights. Unfortunately for them, however, none of these claims hold any water, and I'll prove it using these. These are just empty papers again. I have all the studies as PDFs or on websites, but that just doesn't have the same gravitas. Part 3. Why the TERFs are wrong. 1. Children are being forced into trans identities or they are becoming gender confused by today's radical view on gender. This confusion is bound to lead to unhappiness and unnecessary suffering. This argument goes in a couple of different directions. Either it argues that our society, with its woke values, are making children confused about their gender, basically turning confused cis kids into trans kids. In its more extreme form, it argues that liberal or lefty parents are forcing their children to be trans to suit their political agenda or to get social points from other progressive parents. As evidence of this, they cite the high rates of detransitioning among trans youth, a claim I'll address a bit later in this video, or they cite the high rates of depression and anxiety among trans youth, which they effectively blame on the idea that a lot of trans youth are in fact cis youth who have been tricked or forced to live as trans. The main issue with these claims, and this is going to become somewhat of a common theme throughout this video, is that the data just doesn't bear this out. But before I go into that, I need to explain the concept of social transitioning. To a lot of people who aren't trans, the understanding of transitioning is basically that you take a bunch of hormones and that you surgically change your genitals. And that is an important part of transitioning. It's called medical transitioning. But there is another major form of transitioning that isn't discussed as often. Social transition. Social transitioning is the process of changing your name, pronouns, way you dress, cut your hair, etc. to better reflect the gender you identify as. When you hear stories of really young children who have begun transitioning, it is almost always about social transition, not medical transition. But let's get back into why the TERF argument is wrong about all of this. For this one, I'll cite a study published in the AACAP in 2016, which importantly notes that many previous studies on trans children who have not begun social transitioning have indeed shown that trans kids have a massively increased risk of both depression and anxiety when compared to cis children. However, this study, which looked at depression and anxiety rates in trans children who have socially transitioned, found that there was basically no difference in depression rates between cis children and trans children who have socially transitioned, with only a marginal difference in anxiety rates. So basically, trans children do suffer from a ton of mental health issues if you don't let them transition. If the trans argument was true, and a bunch of cis children are being tricked, pushed, or forced into living as trans, then why does affirmation have a positive effect on them? If I was a cis kid who was forced to socially transition, then that would not have a positive effect on my mental health. I would be miserable, but that misery just doesn't bear out in the data, unlike the very real aforementioned misery of trans children who are not allowed to socially transition. So why are so many kids becoming trans? Well, to discuss that, I'll look at a study from 2009 which studies the history of human left-handedness. Basically, the study finds that humans are naturally predisposed to be right-handed, with only between 8 and 10% of people being naturally left-handed. However, the study found that throughout certain periods of history, this number has been much lower, and attributes this, at least partially, to left-handed people being encouraged, pressured, or directly forced to live as right-handed people. Basically, the natural number of left-handed people was suppressed by unaccepting social norms. But how does this relate to trans youth? Well, just as you can make a left-handed person live as a right-handed one, with unaccepting social norms, you can make a trans person live as a cis person. You can effectively suppress the natural number of trans people, and the worst part is, an affected trans child might not even realize it. How are they supposed to explain, understand, and verbalize the feelings of gender dysphoria if they haven't been given the words to explain that concept? What's happening today is not a bunch of cis children becoming confused at the options. It's that a bunch of trans children who would have otherwise been stuck in a closet have been given clarity. They've been given the words to explain and verbalize what they're feeling and what they're going through. I am non-binary, which is a trans identity, and as you may have guessed, I was assigned male at birth and grew up as a boy. However, for as long as I can remember, I never felt at home as one. I felt that something was off, but I couldn't explain that to my friends or my family. I didn't have the words to explain that hollowness that I felt. I just assumed that all boys had existential crises about the very idea of being a boy, which I have later found out from cis friends is not a very usual cis experience. I could place myself in a ton of other categories. I was a nerd, I was a relatively smart kid, but I never felt at home being called a boy. Unwelcomed as I felt, I considered myself a boy, and why? Well, I was presented with no other option. I thought that the options were to be a boy or a girl, and I knew I wasn't a girl, so I had to be a boy. When you grew up, people weren't trans, because instead they were miserable. They were miserable and stuck in closets they might not even have known about. And let me tell you from personal experience that invisible closets suck. Nowadays, trans people don't have to hide in invisible closets. They can perfectly see the closets they're forced to hide in to avoid their families disowning them. As the possibility of being trans is shown to more kids, more of those kids will realize that they are trans, that they always were trans, that they just have words to explain that now. TERFs often treat the very existence of trans people as them pushing an agenda or causing confusion. But no, cis children aren't becoming confused. What's confusing is being trans and not having the means to explain or even understand what you are going through. So in conclusion, TERFs claim that children are being pushed or tricked into becoming trans, and this is proven in the poor mental health statistics of trans youth. But the studies just don't bear that out. The studies show that trans youth have a massively increased risk of mental health issues, but that cannot be attributed to them being cis children who have been tricked or pushed, but rather them being trans kids who have been stigmatized or not given enough affirmation or access to transition. They have heard that trans youth suffer from mental health issues and then just sort of assume the explanation for why that is, either because they heard it in the news or because they already have a strong idea of what they want the explanation to be. And oftentimes they want the explanation for trans kids' mental health issues to be gender confusion or woke parents. But the simple facts are that the mental health issues that trans kids suffer from are because of transphobic actions or policies. Oh, and just to do some due diligence, here are a couple of more studies that corroborates the results of the study I mentioned before. But let's look closer at the mental health arguments. Perhaps there really is something there. Perhaps the TERFs have struck home. Perhaps the science will show how destructive transness is. Spoiler, it doesn't. It's just them going off of their hunches again. 2. A ton of trans people suffer from mental health issues with high rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidality. By discouraging trans identities, we save people from the suffering associated with being trans. This argument is surprisingly common in my experience, and it can either be a very useful angle for a discussion or completely worthless, and it depends on one simple thing. Is the TERF in question actually concerned about trans people's mental health, or are they just concern trolling and just using trans mental health statistics as a weapon against trans rights? The argument is basically just TERFs looking at trans suicide, anxiety, and depression rates and going, look at how bad the situation is. Look at how terrible trans people have it. Look at how horrible it is to be trans. We need to save people from being trans. And people who genuinely believe in that argument are, in my experience, some of the easiest people to pull over from their transphobia by simply presenting the facts. Because yes, trans people suffer from way more mental health issues than the average population and have a much higher suicide rate, and that is a massive, massive issue. But if you care about that issue, if you care about trans people's mental health, then the first step to solving that issue is actually really simple. Affirm the identity of trans people. To demonstrate this fact, let's start out by looking at a Canadian study from 2012. It compared the suicide attempt rates among trans youth. It looked at trans youth who were out of the closet, had begun social transitioning, and compared whether the suicide rates differed depending on the level of parental support for their gender identity and expression. And the results were staggering. Among trans youth whose parents were only somewhat supportive or not supportive at all of their gender identity and expression, the number who had attempted suicide in the last year was a terrible and terrifying 57%. That same number for trans youth whose parents were very supportive of their gender identity and expression was 4%. Let that sink in for a moment. The suicide attempt rate drops by 53% if parents strongly support and affirm their children in their trans identities. 53%, that's 13/14. That's both staggering and tragic, because I can't help but think of all of the trans youth who have killed themselves, and how many of them might still be alive if their parents accepted and supported them in their identity. This study is only accounting for parental support. It doesn't account for how you're treated by your friends, by teachers, or at work, or by society at large. By just having the strong support of your parents, the risk of having attempted suicide in the last year drops by 53%. The risk of having contemplated suicide is reduced by half, and the risk of having depressive symptoms is cut to 1/3. This study makes it so obvious that what trans people need is support and affirmation, not efforts to dissuade them or other people from being trans. It makes it so blatantly clear that if we care about trans people, the course of action is obvious. We should offer them affirmation and support. But that's just one study, so let's corroborate further. A meta-analysis from Cornell studied 55 studies which examined the effects of medical transition upon the well-being of trans people. In 51 studies, medical transition was shown to have a positive effect on the well-being of trans people. In 4 of them, they had a mixed or neutral effect. In 0 of the 55 studies, medical transition was shown to have a negative effect. I will be honest, I did not read all of the 55 studies. I did skim through some of them though, and tried to check whether it was mentioned anywhere that discouraging trans identities would have a positive impact on their well-being, but nothing of that sort was mentioned. The analysis does, however, mention that transgender individuals, particularly those who cannot access treatment for gender dysphoria or who encounter unsupportive social environments, are more likely than the general population to experience health challenges such as depression, anxiety, suicidality, and minority stress. While gender transition can mitigate these challenges, the health and well-being of transgender people can be harmed by stigmatizing and discriminatory treatment. Simply put, medical transition makes trans people less likely to suffer from mental health issues, but those benefits can be undercut by transphobia, lack of social support, and discrimination. So yes, trans people do suffer disproportionately from mental health issues, but those issues are not because they are trans. It's because of transphobia. It's because of discrimination and hostility they face for being trans. So in summary, the main issue regarding trans people in today's society is transphobia. It's not woke parents. It's not that being trans inevitably leads to suffering. It's not that we are too affirming towards trans people in today's society. It's the opposite. The issues regarding trans people develop when we fail to offer trans people the support and affirmation they need. So if you cite the mental health argument without seeking to create an inclusive environment for trans people, then you either 1, don't know the facts, 2, don't care about the facts, or 3, don't care about trans people. But the frightening truth is that a lot of people are in that last category. A lot of people simply do not care about trans people. Trans people have been demonized so much in conservative media in the last few years. that to a frightening number of TERFs, the goal isn't to help trans people, it's to be rid of trans people. And those people don't mention trans depression, anxiety, or suicide rates because they care or are concerned about their health and well-being. They cite them because they want to frame being trans as a mental illness. To them, it's not that trans people are suffering from mental health issues, it's that being trans is a mental health issue. Something really stuck out to me about this when I was reading online in preparation for this video. Studies are rarely cited in online discussions, but the few times the TERFs did cite studies, they consistently cited studies which disagreed with their own assertions. They cited studies that showed the terrible mental health statistics of trans people, but when I looked at the conclusions of those studies, they inevitably cited lack of social support and access to transition as two prominent reasons for those issues. But to a shocking number of TERFs, that just doesn't matter. They don't care because they don't care about the reason for trans people's mental health issues. They don't care what explanation a study has to offer. They just want the raw numbers because then they can assume the explanation. They can themselves decide what the reason for trans people's mental health issues are. They can just assume that they were already right in whatever they choose to believe. And many TERFs want to believe that being trans is a mental health issue comparable to any other psychological affliction, that it's not an identity but an illness, and those fighting for trans rights are trying to spread that illness. Because if framed in that light, then fighting against trans rights and refusing to affirm their identity becomes a noble cause. It becomes standing up to a woke mob rather than what it actually is, which is bigotry, plain and simple. They are willing to twist the science to fit their narrative, a narrative built on mental health statistics that they help drive up, because it's transphobic attitudes like theirs and transphobic policies built on attitudes like theirs that are in large part causing the terrible mental health numbers that they are complaining about. So when TERFs talk about these claims and using them as an argument, they are effectively complaining about an issue that they have caused. So that was my first video. I know there's a lot of room for improvement. I am not unaware of the, let's say, unpolished production quality, and the fact that I said some version of support and affirmation in like half of the clips in this video. I actually don't like being on camera, and I have no recording experience, but it was a lot of fun recording this, and I hope it was informative and interesting for anyone out there watching. All of the studies I mentioned in this video are linked in the description below. I will hopefully be uploading regularly, so if you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, follow me on Twitter, and leave a comment below with suggestions for what you'd want from a future video. This is something I'd love to continue doing, and if you want to support me in that process, then please support me on Patreon or donate to my PayPal. My next video will be on why TERFs are wrong about detransitioning and bathroom bills. But for now, thank you for watching and have a lovely day.